Hey, it's Mazzy here, and this, to some, will be a sacrilegious video. I'm doing a ranking of 11 of the Beatles' American album releases. Now, a little background here. Why 11? Weren't there more? Yeah, but from Sgt. Pepper on, the configurations of the American albums versus the original UK masterworks are identical. Now, we're not talking about pressings. We're talking about the configurations. Just a little background. Before I start, let me just show you a few things. Parlophone was the label the Beatles were on in the United Kingdom, parent company EMI. When the Beatles were having hits in the UK and throughout parts of Western Europe, EMI offered the Beatle albums to Capitol Records in America. Capitol Records was the American subsidiary, the American sister partner with EMI. EMI would send records to Capitol Records and they would release them if they felt they were appropriate for the American market. Well, initially Capitol said, we don't get this Beatle crap. So Capitol didn't put out the Beatles. And the Beatles went on several labels. Their records came out in singles on singles from Swan Records. VJ decided to pick up and put out the Beatles. Now, VJ was a soul, R&B, jazzy kind of label, an R&B label. So for them to do the Beatles, unheard of, but they put the Beatles out. Didn't really start happening, but it got a little airplay here and there. But not going into the whole history, but just to give you a little background before we do the actual 11 LP count back. Countdown, count back. Introducing the Beatles, VJ. Now, this came out in a lot of different reconfigurations. VJ, basically, once the Beatles did hit and Capitol did decide to put them out, which I'll get to in a bit, they reconfigured this anyway to make money because they had a limited time. A year, maybe. I don't know all the details. You can read that in countless books and probably in other YouTube videos. But they put this out. There are various versions of this. There's also a lot of counterfeit versions of this album. But it has, I saw her standing there, Misery, Anna, Chains, Boys, Love Me Do, P.S. I Love You, Baby It's You, Do You Want to Know a Secret, Taste of Honey, There Is a Place, and of course the great Twist and Shout, which ends this record. Another example of what VJ did. They included England's greatest recording stars, the Beatles and Frank Ifield on stage. Frank Ifield did nothing in America, and it has songs by Frank Ifield, and it has, 4 songs by the Beatles. And then, of course, there's this infamous record, the Beatles, Songs, Pictures, and Stories. You can have all their information on what they like to eat, their birth signs, their height, their weight, the color of their hair, their favorite actress, Paul McCartney loves, and Margaret. Pretty cool, right? Oh, so you can put your pictures here. So you can marry and have kissy stuff with the Beatles. Reissue of Introducing the Beatles, the song Configuration. And this is You Be the Judge, Score the Rounds, the Beatles versus the Four Seasons. And you could actually literally score track by track, go back and forth, and see how your score adds up between the Beatles and the Four Seasons. Then Capitol decides to put out I Want to Hold Your Hand and follows up with an album, Meet the Beatles, and the rest is history. Now, the Beatles' American albums were changed for the American audiences. For every about 2 albums the Beatles actually made for Parlophone Records, there were 3 put out by the American label Capitol. 14 tracks were common in the UK. In America, 12 tracks. Because, again, the more tracks you put out, the more publishing you pay. So the more profit is on a 12-track record over the 14 record. Also, for the American audience, a lot of reverb was added. Different mixes in some case, but literally reverb added to the masters, to the recordings for the American audience. Dave Dexter was the gentleman that we all know, and there was something known as Dexterization that added reverb, and you can hear it on so many of the early tracks. Very different. But my generation, we all grew up with these records and we love these records. We didn't really know the difference maybe till the later 60s, which all of a sudden things started happening. Like around Revolver, we started getting, at least I started getting imports shipped here, and I could hear the difference in the configuration. That's where it was a huge difference. This I'll just show, I'm not including this in my top 11 rankings. This is the Beatles story. Another way for Capitol to take advantage and make some money on the Beatles. No real music. LA DJs doing voiceover with screaming in interviews. And it started in Liverpool, England. And that's how this album opens. After the intro, they use the recordings from the Hollywood Strings, doing sort of instrumental, lush, Muzaki cover version instrumentals of Beatles songs. And there's bits of interviews here and there. The Beatles story, we all had to have it. Anybody into the Beatles had to have this record, The Beatles Story. A narrative and musical biography of Beatlemania on 2 long-playing records. Includes selections, snippets from their hit records. And now the countdown, the American albums, from number 11 to number 1. Ranking. Mazzy's ranking, my point of view. Coming in number 11, Something New. Some people call it Something New, but if you look on the spine, it's Something New Only Once. Great picture from the Ed Sullivan Theater, from the Ed Sullivan Show in February of 1964. Now, all great songs. Again, this ranking, every song is great, and I'm just talking about the ranking, the configurations, how I felt about these records at the time. Now, of course, I cannot get away from, in retrospect, ranking these records, because what we know now and what I knew later with the United Kingdom versions of their albums, the way they are intended, it's hard to judge these in the same way. Things we said today, anytime at all, When I Get Home, Slow Down, Matchbox, and the German version of Komm, Gib mir deine Hand. Unfortunately, they didn't squeeze on Sib Lib dich, the German version of She Loves You. But what they put on here are 5 tracks from A Hard Day's Night. And we'll get to Hard Day's Night a little later. The reason Hard Day's Night songs are on here, because when the soundtrack came out, when the movie was made, and a lot of reasons, some will say Walter Shenson, the producer of Hard Day's Night, wanted it so United Artists would get a soundtrack. Capitol couldn't put it out because the movie came out on United Artists, so they would get the soundtrack. They would get a Beatle album. So that's why it wasn't packed with other songs on side 2 like the British version. We'll get to that. It includes some Muzaki soundtrack stuff, which actually I like. And then several months after the motion picture came out and the soundtrack on United Artists came out, Capitol got the rights to some of those songs, the 5 songs from the motion picture, and added it to this collection. The Beatles 6. Again, a great album, kind of an okay cover. Includes Kansas City, 8 Days a Week, You Like Me Too Much, Bad Boy, Don't Want to Spoil the Party, Words of Love. You know, great record, produced by George Martin, dexterized. Most of these early on I have, I'm showing the mono versions with some exceptions. But coming in number 10, Beatles 6. I like it. It was a lot of Beatle albums. Remember, 64, a shitload of Beatle albums came out, and they were all in the top 10 on the charts. Coming in at number 9, Yesterday and Today. This came out in 1966, early in 66, prior to Revolver that same year. That was the big album the Beatles made that year. But Capitol wanted to rush out yet another album with singles. Another reason, in the UK, the Beatles put out singles, and they wanted more value for their fans. Almost none of their singles were included on the albums. They were separate. So you'd buy the singles, you wouldn't get it repeated, maybe except their first album. You wouldn't get it included on the album. But in America, Capitol has jammed those singles on albums and made an extra album and packed singles. So Capitol takes this, originally this. This is the cover that from a photograph Robert Whittaker took. He did several sessions with the Beatles. The photographer was very into avant-garde, surrealism, photography, and he created this image that Capitol put out and send it to, didn't actually make it to the stores yet, to buyers, to radio stations, and the controversy erupted, and they pasted this cover on it. This is number 9 on my list. Great selection of songs. I think remember when I got this, Act Naturally, I didn't love that Ringo cover of that country song at the time, a Buck Owens song. I like it now. It just didn't seem to fit with this record. What happened is Capitol wanted some songs, so George Martin had to rush over some of the early songs they were working on for the album that would become Revolver. And they took I'm Only Sleeping, Dr. Robert, and Your Bird Can Sing, these great John Lennon songs that were robbed from Revolver and included on here. They're different mixes. They're different sounding. Once I heard the UK records, I was gobsmacked. The guitar work is different. I wish this album stayed with this cover. Interesting album, but number 9, Yesterday and Today, because of that Revolver breakup. But it has these great singles. 2 of my favorite songs, one of my favorite Beatles, double A side I'm saying, is Day Tripper and We Can Work It Out. I think We Can Work It Out is a perfect Beatles song, one of my all-time favorite songs. This has a lot of sentimental reasons to me. Beatles 65. This is the closest thing to Beatles for Sale, the UK album with the Robert Freeman picture. These are more photographs by Robert Whittaker. Coming at number 8 is Beatles 65. Came out Christmas 64. The time my parents gave me this and my first stereo for my own room. I'd go in the living room on the big hi-fi and have my records all over the floor and play it. And I think my parents just wanted me to go in my room, shut the door, and turn the music on. And I remember it was a Magnavox pull down. The speakers kind of pivoted out. And I remember playing this record. I had the sense memory thing of the opening of No Reply. There's a haunting sound to John's voice on that. And then, of course, I'm a Loser. The back-to-back, the opening of those 2 songs. And I love this. I actually like this cover. I think it's a really interesting cover about the seasons, about the conceptualism of the Beatles and of the photographer Robert Whittaker. It goes into Babies in Black, rock and roll music, one of the great vocals of John Lennon. I would argue it's better than the Chuck Berry version. All Follow the Sun, beautiful. And it ends with Mr. Moonlight. And I remember everyone I knew hated that song. I love that cover of that song, Mr. Moonlight. John singing, and that organ is so tough. That is a great, great thing. Honey Doan, I'll Be Back, one of the great rhythm guitar strumming in that song. She's a Woman, of course. The version here has all this reverb, drenched in reverb, that guitar chords series that opens and dressed in reverb, which you didn't get on the Beatles single version. I Feel Fine, possibly, one would argue, the very first time of rock and roll feedback, guitar feedback, amp feedback on a record. It opens up with that feedback, and of course, closing out with Everybody Trying to Be My Baby, the Carl Perkins song, sung by George Harrison fabulously. Coming in number 7, the early Beatles. Cover image from Beatles for Sale, from Robert Freeman, the great photographer Robert Freeman. 11 of their 1964 American hits now on Capitol. So Capitol is finally getting their earlier hits and putting out things that they didn't have earlier on. They didn't either have access to, or they hadn't put it on an album. So of course, Capitol has to do whatever they can. This has 12 cuts, including some of their very early singles that were huge in the UK. Love Me Do. Of course, Twist and Shout again. Ask Me Why. I love Ask Me Why. Boys. Please Please Me. I mean, their great number 1 hit, and the first number 1 hit in the UK. What a great song. It finally makes it on an American album. P.S. I Love You, Baby It's You, and George Harrison again singing Do You Want to Know a Secret? Dexter Dies added reverb, different sound to it, 12 songs, but the Beatles, number 7. Coming in number 6, the American soundtrack to help. Capitol finally gets a soundtrack. It's not on United Artists this time. There's controversy with this for some people because in Britain, everyone knows the great Beatle album Help with the Beatles on the cover in the snow. A full Beatle album, all Beatles song. This is a soundtrack. This has what they call incidental music. Opens up with this guitar riff a la James Bond. Remember, this is the time of the secret agent movies, and James Bond was all over everywhere. In like Flint would happen. All the secret agent rage was happening around the world in cinema. And a lot of ways, that's the reason of the story here, of the espionage, of the intrigue of Help. Some people think it was a little gimmicky, a little forced, but it's a fun movie when you're a kid especially. It has some really interesting incidental music. Ken Thorne did an excellent job taking some Beatles songs, adding some instrumentation, adding some Indian styling sounds, Indian music arrangement, classical Indian arrangements, and really wonderfully mixes up classical music. I've said many times in some of my videos that I got turned on to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. It's not on here, but from the movie in the tiger scene, Beethoven's Ninth, one of my all-time favorite classical pieces. I got turned on to Wagner's Prelude to Lohengrin, Act 3, when Paul shrinks down in the apartment fight in the motion picture. I love this soundtrack. I think it really mixed a lot of music, and the Beatles songs with the incidental music and the classical tidbits, I think are really wonderful. And I'm a big fan of this record. So coming in number 6, the soundtrack, the American soundtrack to Help. Coming in at number 5, A Hard Day's Night. Now, of course, the British version of A Hard Day's Night is better. Side 1 has the soundtrack songs. Side 2, an amazing array of Beatles songs. They're all fantastic. But this is a United Artist soundtrack. It's a soundtrack. The difference between what the Beatles put out in the United Kingdom and this, that's not a soundtrack. That's songs from A Hard Day's Night, included with some of their other great songs. This is actually a soundtrack with George Martin doing the instrumental versions of the song. Of course, he does an instrumental version of I Should Have Known Better, and I Love Her with the great woodblock, really kind of a beautiful classical guitar, nylon string guitar interlude in that. Ringo's theme, This Boy. I mean, that'll be always associated with that great scene of Ringo on his own walking along the river in London. And of course, ending with a really jazzy, swinging 60s, mid-60s version of A Hard Day's Night. I love this record. I think this is a brilliant record. I think it's a fun record. It's just, this is one of those records that maybe got your parents to listen to the Beatles a little more for the first time, because they heard the songs and they heard this sort of this groovy hipster and instrumental, maybe Muzak-y to some version of A Hard Day's Night. So coming in number 5 on my American list, again with these great photographs by Robert Freeman, who actually did the closing credits on both Help and A Hard Day's Night. The imagery created those sequences. This is a fantastic record. Number 4 is Revolver. 1966, great album cover with this great montage from Klaus Voormann, a friend of the Beatles since Germany, mixing with pictures, Robert Freeman and Robert Whittaker photographs within here. Great back cover. Great record. How can you not love this record? This is what my friends and I heard for at least a year or two before we heard the British album. And that really changed with the mixes. The mixes are very different on this album than the British album. I originally got stereo. This is where I was all in on stereo, so I didn't get the mono right away. The only problem with this album are the 3 Lennon songs they took away and put on Yesterday and Today. We didn't know that at the time. So at that time, it didn't matter. But once we heard the UK version, oh my God, this is a piece of crap. Not really, but they took away And Your Bird Can Sing, I'm Only Sleeping, and Dr. Robert. Arguably 3 of John Lennon's best songs. Creative, at the peak of his creativity. The psychedelia, the guitar riff and Your Bird Can Sing, that double tracking on that song is just sublime. I'm Only Sleeping's got that, hey, when I wake up early in the morning, kind of a little groove to it, which, could be a soul song, It just had a great feel to it. Love that. And if you listen to the outtakes that were later on the anthology and the outtake albums, you really kind of hear that little vibe thing, that real kind of grooviness to that song, what it could have been. But that and Dr. Robert, the The well, well, well part, the harmonies and double tracked in that, just so, so awesome. But amazing album. Again, only because we know what we didn't know and we knew later what we know now, this became, I mean, Tomorrow Never Knows. That's the perfect name and description of this. Tomorrow never knows that we're going to know that this is going to be one of the best albums and maybe the best album the Beatles ever did in the UK configuration. But Capitol, you know, remixes, you hear backwards guitar that are different in some of the mixes on here, and some of the mixes on Yesterday and Today that would show up on Revolver. There. Coming at number 3, and Just Because, Meet the Beatles. This started it all for most Americans. This is where it changed. Opening up with I Want to Hold Your Hand, that single literally changed my life and millions of other young kids and teenagers' lives in 1964. That's the song that broke the Beatles in America. This whole album, I saw her standing there, this boy, It Won't Be Long. The singing on It Won't Be Long, the yelling, oh my God, that song, All I Gotta Do, All My Lovin', Don't Bother Me. George Harrison has a cool opening track. Little Child, Till There Was You. That might have been the weird thing at the time for us to hear because we knew that song from the Music Man, the Broadway Music Man and the Motion Picture Music Man. And of course, McCartney singing, I never saw them. Saw them. He didn't say I never saw them. He said saw them. What the fuck are you saying, Paul? Where's that accent from? Do all Liverpudlians say sore? I don't know. Hold Me Tight. That is a great, that's a rocker. That's like a powerful song there. I Want to Be Your Man, the song that Ringo sang, the song the Beatles gave away to the Rolling Stones for their first top hit. Written for the Stones, not a great song. I wish there was a version of that song sung by John Lennon, but you know, Ringo does it well, and of course not a second time. So coming in number 3, Meet the Beatles, great Robert Freeman cover that was used on with the Beatles in the UK, more of a blue tint here than the straight black and white, various different color versions of this over the pressing history. I mean, figuring this out on Discogs is going to be like a shit show to figure out what pressings I have of all these albums. Coming at number 2, the Beatles' second album. Why is this album so high? This album is arguably the best rock and roll record the Beatles ever put out. Now, accidentally, a mistake by Capitol, are we lucky? This is their most consistently rockin' record. This only was configured in America. This could only be put out by Capitol, different mixes, different sound, dextrization, reverbization. But you got Roll Over Beethoven. What a great song to start with. Thank You, Girl. You Really Got a Hold on Me. Lennon's doing that great Smokey Robinson track, and he just nails it. I mean, Tighter, Devil in Her Heart. That was one of my early first favorite songs that George Harrison sang. I just love that song. John Lennon singing Money. You Can't Do That, Long Tall Sally, I'll Call Your Name, Please Mr. Postman. Wait, another of the girls group cover songs, I'll Get You, and of course closing out with probably one of their best early songs, She Loves You. What a groundbreaking song that was, and what a powerful song. This is a great record. There's a wonderful book, you should seek it out, by Dave Marsh, who used to write for Rolling Stone and wrote Rock and Roll and Rock and Rap Confidential. One of the great music critics and music writers. He wrote a book called The Beatles' Second Album, a tiny, small little, almost like a thesis about this album alone and why it is the best rock and roll album by the Beatles. Fantastic record. Cover was mimicked by so many other bands. I think there's a Yola Tango record that mimics this cover. Several other artists have mimicked the design of this Capitol record cover. I mean, it's definitely a design of its time, 1964. But number 2 on my chart of the best Capitol American Beatle records and United Artists, with one record in this list. Number 2 is the Beatles' second album. And number 1 is Rubber Soul. Accident? Happy Accident by Capitol Records. I'm not the only one. A lot of Americans feel that Rubber Soul, the US configuration is better than the original UK version that the Beatles and George Martin created. It's a different album. It's a smoky, acoustic, folksy masterpiece. This is a perfect record. This American version is a perfect record. It opens up with I've Just Seen a Face, that great sort of almost skiffle-like Paul McCartney song, goes into Norwegian Wood. When that came out and I read that George Harrison was on sitar, I thought there was a typo. I thought a sitar was a guitar, and they messed it up. You Won't See Me, Think for Yourself, The Word, Michelle. Really good acoustic feel. The great photograph by Robert Freeman. They, even John and Ringo in these kind of cowboyish brown leather makes it even more folksy and gives the illusion that it's a folk rock record, maybe the first great folk rock records ever, aside from the Byrds and yes, okay, we'll give the Byrds that. But remember, this is 1965 too, and that Byrds, Mr. Tamarine Man, I think that Byrds and the Beatles really influenced each other quite a bit. This great photograph of Robert Freeman, when he projected it and showed the Beatles this record, he showed it on a piece of cardboard that started bending, convex, concave, and the Beatles liked the effect, and that's what they used. And I think this also is the first album by a big pop group that didn't have the name of the group on the cover. The Beatles were probably the only artists in that day that could get away with not putting their album. All it said was Rubber Soul. There might have been a sticker, a hype sticker also, but this didn't say the Beatles. It wasn't, you didn't have to say the Beatles. You knew those faces in 1965. Now, on side 2 opens up with It's Only Love and goes into Girl. 2 of what I would say are the best vocals of John Lennon. They tug at your heart. They're beautiful. You feel his emotion and the way he's singing those 2 songs with Girl and It's Only Love, and That Is All. Amazing, amazing songs. Now, the reason I'm showing mono and stereo in this case is the song I'm Looking Through You, Paul's song. I think I got, and I might be confusing this, I got the mono version, and some years later I got the stereo version. And when I heard the stereo version, I had to stop. I got out of my seat and had to play that song again, because it opens up with that guitar riff with an extra false start. Da-dun, dun, 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 dun. I'm looking through. Anyway, it's the false start is only on the stereo, I believe. And if I'm wrong, you can list that in the comments below. But anyway, one has the false start and one does not. It's such a great song, and just that was probably one of the first times I ever started thinking about different versions of a record, aside from the mixes with Revolver and Yesterday and Today and the like. And of course, In My Life with George Martin on piano, one of John's most beautiful autobiographical song. I hear that song so many times when I have friends that pass on it. It's just it reminds me of my youth, as all these records and songs do. And then Wait, and of course, the song that would probably never be written today, Run for Your Life. I'd rather see a dead little girl than to be with another man. Of course, another lyric that John Lennon ripped off from, was it a Chuck Berry song? But number 1, Rubber Soul, an incredible record. It wasn't until 1987 when the Beatles and Capitol and EMI released CDs that all the American releases were discarded, discontinued, and in America, from the CD point and all the records at that point on, were all the British original configurations. But a lot of us who grew up at this time in this place we have a place in our hearts for these records, because we grew up with these records. We heard them literally thousands of times. They sold millions upon millions of records, and they're the records that we got used to in our younger days. Is there anything better than number 1? In my videos, yes. Beyond Revolver, beyond Rubber Soul, beyond the Beatles' second album, Capitol did something right. Capitol did something better than the Beatles even thought of, and that was Magical Mystery Tour. This was originally an American-only collection. In the UK, Magical Mystery Tour was an EP, only for that debacle of a film romp around the English countryside that was shown in black and white on Boxing Day in the UK. And it was their first failure, artistic failure and commercial failure. But it has its moments, it has its charm. But the album that Capitol put together with all the songs from the EP, from the motion picture, from the TV special, along with some of the greatest singles the Beatles would ever record. Hello, Goodbye, Penny Lane, Baby You're a Rich Man, All You Need Is Love, a major accomplishment, but possibly one of their greatest records. Maybe not songs, but greatest records, avant-garde, Stockhausen influenced, artistic, beautiful creations of that John Lennon song he wrote. He started writing in Spain, Strawberry Fields Forever. And the way George Martin put that together with the various takes, speeding up, slowing down, editing the song, that was configured on this album. This album is so good that it has become canon with all those great United Kingdom records. This is the best thing that came out of Capitol Records. This is a fabulous psychedelic masterpiece. I would argue that this is the best psychedelic album collected with Beatles. Love this record. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate all the support. Mazzy loves you.